Welcome to the seminar, Threat Assessment in Schools. Hello, I'm Karen McKelvey. I'm the Director of PSI's Professional Development Services, and we are so pleased to have so many of you registered today. School violence and threatening behaviors continue to be issues that affect all of us. PSI staff works with hundreds of students daily in our roles as school psychologists and counselors, school health personnel, educational specialists, and speech therapists. And we all feel it is vitally important to continue to support our partner schools and other educators by providing cutting-edge expertise in response to this sometimes overwhelming problem of threats that plague so many schools. PSI also has a crisis intervention team to serve our partner schools, and we were fortunate to have been trained by today's presenter, Dr. Scott Poland. Our goal at PSI and our hope for you and for our staff and partner schools is to never meet and never have to face a threat made by or toward a student or staff member or school. Our presenter, Scott Poland, is a PSI expert partner and a premier authority on school safety and violence prevention. He personally has responded in the aftermath of 13 school shootings and has authored several books and articles on school safety, youth violence, suicide, and bullying. During this presentation today, the audience will be electronically muted. If at the end you have questions, or even during the webinar itself, use that chat function to the side there to submit your questions. Dr. Poland will answer as many as possible in the time allotted once he finishes. Those that are not answered can be answered later by Scott Poland with his information that's posted on the PSI website. We are recording this presentation for those who couldn't register or attend. PSI's contact information will be on the last slide. And now, on behalf of all of us at PSI, I am so pleased to present Dr. Scott Poland.
It's indeed my pleasure to have a chance to talk with all of you today. Hope to say some things that'll be meaningful and helpful. With regard to threat assessment, going back to really the Secret Service report about targeted school shooters in 2000 and 2002, that's when we first were given this really strong recommendation that every school should have a threat assessment team. And traveling throughout the country and meeting a lot of school personnel, I find that so often there is not a team. And I do believe the wisest decisions in education are made by a team of people. Today we'll talk about that team. We'll talk about some of the issues that really schools are facing. And, what is threat assessment? Well, it's really a process where we're trying to evaluate, could somebody seriously be planning and could they carry out a threat of violence? And today, many of those threats are actually being posted on social media, which is creating lots of difficulties for schools. And in some way, I'm going to argue that the term threat assessment is almost a bit of a misnomer. We really should be talking about threat reduction, because what we're trying to do, of course, is figure out whether the threat is a transient one or a substantial one. But the bottom line is, if we can reduce the stressors on the person that supposedly made a threat, it's going to be much less likely to be carried out. So we really have to figure out what's the intervention process, what do we need to do. Here are just a couple of examples. One of these made the national news last year because it was a suburb of Dallas. The young man, who happened to be Islamic, had made a clock he was very proud of, brought it into school to show it off to his teacher, and pretty quickly was handcuffed, suspended, and arrested. It's interesting that that young man actually ended up meeting with President Obama and was given a scholarship to a school in some location. So I begin with this because part of my goal today is to make sure we're being careful and thorough in evaluating threats, but also we should not be overreacting. And again, is it appropriate to suspend kids from school and expel them because they were dressed up like the Columbine shooters on Halloween? I mean, a much more important question would be, did they have weapons? Did they have a plan? Did they have a grudge? Did they have any kind of a hit list? And actually, the literature has talked a little bit about Ohio maybe experiencing a higher volume of threat to violence at school than almost any other state in the nation. So we're going to be talking about how do we respond to these threats as we move on and look at a very specific example. There was a school shooting at Arapahoe High School in Colorado. It was about 2 years ago. And unfortunately, a young woman by the name of Claire Davis was killed. Colorado has actually passed the Claire Davis Safety Act in her memory. And basically, that act is removing the automatic or sovereign immunity that schools have historically always been granted after an act of violence. And basically, her parents agreed to drop their lawsuit if the school would just simply acknowledge what did they know about the perpetrator. They had done a threat assessment. What did they find out? And there's actually a very informative report that all of you could find very quickly if you were to Google Arapahoe High School school shooting report. And I can't go over it in great detail, but I think it's really important that I talk about FERPA for a moment. And actually, one of my colleagues said, we need to make certain we don't have FERPA phobia. Well, it's important that I clarify for all of you that in an emergency situation, FERPA basically says, not only can we share information with everybody who needs to know, but we should share that information. And in that report on Arapahoe, you'll find a quote from the superintendent basically saying, a number of my staff members had a lot of important information. Unfortunately, they did not talk to each other. And as a result, that violence was not prevented. So I'm encouraging all of you to share information, to work as a team. This is absolutely critically important. So a couple of key things about a threat, as we know, it can be verbal, it can be written, it can be gestured, it could be in the form of some type of drawing, for example. So important that we know what to look for. And it's actually an interesting quote at the bottom here, a statement, when in doubt, assume it's a threat, gather information. Where I used to work in Texas, sometimes the assistant principal would say, oh, come on, I know this dude and he's not going to harm anybody. Everybody get back to work. And my thoughts were really, we've got a teacher here who knows the kid in question well. We have a counselor, a school psychologist. We have our school resource officer. We really need to spend a few minutes talking with each other and trying to figure out maybe somebody does have some information that needs to be shared, and we do need to be concerned. And who should conduct a threat assessment and when to do it? The Secret Service talked about this team, which I really just went over, the importance of it being multidisciplinary. And when a behavior reaches a certain threshold, we really need to get together, figure out what we know, what we don't know, be looking at records. Later on, we're going to talk about the importance of interviewing the person who was threatened, interviewing any witnesses, looking at any kind of school records that are going to be helpful to us. And really what we're trying to do is to prevent violence from occurring and identifying what would reduce the stressors on this young person. And we really need to be following best practices, procedures, so we will not be open to liability. And not long ago, I reviewed the threat assessment protocols for a couple of county school districts. but there were just a couple of things missing in their protocol. And I'm going to suggest we need to start at the top. The superintendent and the school board basically needs to give us the authority to conduct a threat assessment and make it very clear this is a part of conducting school today. And then we need to specify that multidisciplinary team, and the team needs training, which is today we only have an hour. It's a start of training, but certainly more extensive trainings are possible with PSI and other entities. And then another really important question is, do we have a relationship between the school and local police, local mental health? Do we have that relationship where the police respond to us and they've talked with us about what kind of things they can do and when they needed to be called? And then very importantly, we need to make sure that our staff, our parents, and our students are educated about our threat assessment policies, and very importantly, everybody needs to know the importance of sharing information and how to report a threat of violence so an appropriate investigation can take place. And I do believe strongly that threats are manageable. I acknowledge these threats being made by the social media are a little more challenging, and some of you might be aware that the New York City Public Schools and the Los Angeles Unified School District essentially received the same threat of violence a couple of months ago. LAUSD canceled school for all 700,000 students. New York City conducted school that day. And I really go with the latter because I believe we do need to recognize schools are the safest places children could possibly be. You cancel school suddenly, you leave lots of parents scrambling for appropriate supervision, and I would conduct school. I'd involve local authorities, I'd have more school personnel visible and available, but I think it was unfortunate that Los Angeles canceled school on that day. And then I cannot overstate the next point, which is, to me, it's all about relationships. That fourth R is relationships, because every kid feels connected to the school and the staff members. Do they trust us? Will they come to us and share important information? And I believe in particular, virtually every school shooting in America committed by a student perpetrator should have been prevented. The Secret Service prior knowledge study said 81% of the time the student perpetrator told one or more other students about what they had planned. How do we create a climate where they come forward? And I want to give you an example. This example, in my opinion, is one of an overreaction from the school. So a middle school student, let's call her B, goes and says her friend is planning something big. Her friend, we're going to refer to her as S. The threat is reported to the administration, taken very seriously. Local police get notified. They interview both of the students separately. B immediately tells the police, I was joking. Look, S is never going to do anything. I was just trying to get some attention from some other students. So obviously they would be meeting with the student reported to have made the threat. S denies it and even says, I thought B was my friend. I don't know why she would have thrown me under the bus. But the police follow up. They go to S's home. They seize her computer. They search Facebook postings. They find no weapons. They find no hit list. They really find no. Who should be thanking you? They really found no reason to think that S could possibly carry out that threat. School records are reviewed. Very important to do that. Going all the way back to elementary school, a few minor incidents, nothing very big. S is a student who does like to draw, and her notebook does have violent themes and drawings. She did a paper on a serial killer, but her paper received an A, and the teacher did not report any concern to the administrators at that time. She's very involved in the church. She takes care of younger siblings. She actually volunteers at a retirement center. Those are some pretty healthy indicators for a kid. Police conclude their investigation and say the threat is totally unfounded. The school district, the principal, is not satisfied. He convenes his own threat assessment team. S says school can be stressful, but I've gone here my whole life. I didn't make this threat. I don't have any grudge or any plan to hurt anyone. So I guess what I'd like all the audience to be thinking of right now is, does this meet the criteria for a substantial threat, which involves a plan, a weapon, a grudge, a history? Do you recommend suspending or expelling the student? In fact, do you believe they ever even made this threat? Well, I'm pretty frustrated to tell you that the young lady was actually expelled for a year, and her parents are actually considering legal actions against the school. And they had their daughter immediately evaluated. An excellent report was written by a forensic psychologist, and basically saying this student is not at risk to carry out an act of violence. The school district did not pay any attention to that report, and the expulsion was upheld. So I believe this is an example of overreacting, and what I'm saying to you is really, you hold the future of these kids in your hands. The safety of everybody is certainly very important, but we also need to make certain that we don't create extreme problems for a young person that had no plan, has really never exhibited any serious warning signs. So earlier I said threat assessment has been recommended by a lot of important agencies and entities, and there they are. So, interesting quote from the FBI report. Although the risk of an actual shooting at school is very low, these threats are potentially a problem once it's made. Having a fair, rational, standardized method of evaluating and responding is critical, and there is the threat assessment perspective from the U.S. Department of Justice. Again, wisest decisions made by a group of people. So I pretty well clarified these roles. There is another excellent resource that is available to everyone from the federal government. These publications are available online as well as hard copy. I would encourage all school personnel listening to get copies and review them. Another example from the district where I used to work. What's a good part of this example? Because obviously Ben, who is a middle school student, posts a threat and lets another student, Julie, know he is planning to shoot up the bus on the way to Blyle Middle School tomorrow. The good thing, Julie goes to her mom, and her mom does absolutely the right thing. She takes action immediately. And you're wondering, well, what action needs to be taken? And I imagine that you immediately think the school needs to know, transportation needs to know because that kid's not riding the bus tomorrow, and most importantly, law enforcement need to know. And don't you really want them to go to Ben's house tonight and make certain that he can't carry out this threatened act of violence? So those are all the initial things that need to take place. So Ben's father brings Ben to school the next morning because he is not allowed to ride the bus and he was not arrested by the local police. So now we need to look at how do we approach Ben? And there's a little model that I'd like to share with you. And I think sometimes, particularly at the administrative level, we begin with telling a kid what's going to happen now and all the trouble they're in. So we're giving them information. And interviewing Ben, here was how I responded. Ben, I want to hear from you. Yes, a lot of people are upset this morning. Here's a copy of an email sent from your computer, but I want to hear your side of this, Ben. So basically, I want to get information from Ben. If I start out by saying, you spent your last day at Blisle Middle School, I don't think he's going to tell me a whole lot. So I like to get information first. Then we obviously, as school personnel, have to give information, merge and make sure that everybody knows what our plan is. Sometimes I'll ask, you ever gone to a school meeting that went on so long you couldn't wait to get out of that meeting, and as you're walking down the hallway you go, I don't even know what we decided, I don't even care, I just want out of there. Obviously we want to merge, have a plan, and have everybody go out with a clear idea of what our role is going to be and what we all decided. So receiving information from Ben is a very important first step, and showing sincere interest in his safety and the safety of all concerned. So Ben readily admits he intended to shoot up the school bus. He particularly was angry at another student named John. John had been bullying him. In fact, John had even broken his thumb last week. Is this sounding a little more substantial, a little more concerning to you? And next steps are certainly going to involve talking with all the students that are on the bus, getting a lot of information out to everybody, meeting with John, meeting with John's parents, in addition, of course, to meeting with Ben's parents. And we need to be looking at Ben's coping mechanisms. What are the stressors that are currently in place in his life? And we do need to approach his father in a manner that's going to enlist his cooperation. And I know in our schools we'd never say, you're a bad parent, that's why we're here. But I suspect sometimes we can convey that non-verbally, and we really need to sincerely show an interest in Ben's welfare. And by the way, Dad's really the only one that's going to be able to lock up the guns, and it's particularly concerning when he says, oh, I mostly work nights. Yes, there's a lot of guns in my homes. No, they're not locked up. And Ben has never been the same ever since his mom died last spring. Can everybody see what the stressors are right now? Aren't you thinking, Dad, can you change your hours? Did you and your son get any grief counseling? If you can't change your hours, didn't you say Aunt Edna lives nearby? It's really important Ben not be alone every evening. So there's going to be a consequence, of course, but let's reduce the stressors on Ben. So that parental cooperation is really important, as well as working to get the grief counseling that Ben needs. So would rumors be flying all around the school? I'm going to argue absolutely. How many people could Julie have forwarded that email to? How many people could her mother have told? What did every kid on Blisle bus 212 talk about all morning? So I believe strongly that administrators need to take action, need to verify, know what's going on, and they need to share information. My wife spent many years as a principal. She would make an announcement. Teachers, please check your email as quickly as possible. It tells them exactly what's happened. It gives them clear direction about what to do, maybe even a script written out by the principal and the psychologist to help all concerned. And certainly, John's mother and his family are going to be very concerned to hear that John was the first intended victim. So, honestly talking with students, faculty, and parents. So, we worked on a letter that was going to be sent home to every one of nearly 1,400 parents. Now, that letter doesn't need to say Ben's name. It just simply needs to say, yes, we had a threat of violence. The police are involved. The young man who made the threat is being placed in the alternative program. We take school safety very seriously here at the middle school. If you have any concerns or any ideas about how we can improve safety at our school, we welcome your input. And if your child is having difficulties, please let us know so that our counseling staff can meet with them. But in today's world, principal really can't just send that letter home or post it on the school website. It needs to be approved by the superintendent. The letter was faxed over to the superintendent's office. The call came back. No, you may not send that letter home. The fewer people that know about this threat of violence, the better. That's very frustrating because in today's world, with social media and text messaging, everybody knows about things quickly. But the superintendent's the boss, so no letter went home. The next morning, I picked up the newspaper in the fourth largest city in America, the headline above the fold, threat of school shooting on Blythe Middle School bus. Is that how you want 1,400 parents to find out about something? And everybody listening today, I know that you've been aware of other incidents where the administration's choice was to try to bury something. It does not work. We really need to be transparent. We need to clarify, here's the problem, and most importantly, here is what we are doing about it. So those are the points that I went over, and I'm obviously advocating for an active sharing response with our public. And there's one thing we cannot lose track of. Schools are the safest places children go. Having said that, one violent incident in a school in America is unacceptable. But I think everybody listening knows the vast majority of children in this country are murdered away from school, and primarily they are murdered in their very own homes. Ben's threat was substantial, meeting all the criteria that I had mentioned earlier. And information was shared with the staff at school, was shared with students, but the letter was not allowed to go home. So that student interview, I mentioned a little bit about this already, but we should be caring, we should be professional, non-confrontational, not be threatening them with consequences. And it's important that we really get to the bottom of what's going on and give every student a chance to tell their personal story. And hopefully we can make a good assessment and hopefully redirect their behavior in a much more positive manner. So there are some other points about, as we're looking at the student that's made the threat, what kind of stressors are involved in their lives? What do we know about their family? What do we know about access to their interest in weapons? What do we know about previous aggressive or violent behavior? What do we know about their coping skills? Are they currently involved in bullying? Could they be victimizing others, or could they be the victim of bullying? What are their weaknesses? What are their strengths? As we try to figure out how we can reduce the stressors on the young person and provide the appropriate interventions and consequences. This pretty much summarizes what I was going over earlier about approaching the parent, and hopefully they will be cooperative and have an appropriate interaction. And we want to make certain that they understand we have their child's welfare and the welfare of every other student. That's our primary focus, and we're trying to really enlist their help as we develop interventions and things for safety. And if they're going to receive outside counseling for their child, it's very important that we get them to sign a release. Several legal cases I've been involved in, school personnel needed to be a little more persuasive and explain, this is how we can help your child the best if we can freely and easily talk to their private therapist, counselor, or physician. So these are the elements of the substantial threat. So you have a chance to just take a moment and look at them. It does involve something of a grudge, a history, a plan, a weapon. It's something that's ongoing. There's been some kind of physical evidence that they have been planning something. And we'll contrast that. Thankfully, most threats of violence in schools are transient. There's something said in a moment of anger or passion. There is no plan. There is no grudge. They're just I'm going to kill somebody. I'm going to beat you up. But there's no plan for that. And these issues can be resolved. There can be an apology. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be some kind of a consequence. But I think expelling a kid from school for saying they're going to do something when they absolutely have no plan, no history, no grudge, no weapon is a bit of an overreaction. But the one thing we do have to get across to our students, and it's quite challenging, you make a bomb threat, you post a threat of a bombing or violence on the social media, those consequences are probably going to be pretty severe, even though maybe it doesn't meet the category of being substantial. And a lot of school administrators have asked, well, what can we do? Well, I think we have to talk to students at the beginning of every year about the consequences of posting these threats of violence or phoning in a bomb threat. We have to talk to their parents. We have to make sure parents have conversations with their children. We have to encourage the parents to pay a lot more attention to online behavior. And very interesting is the proposed legislation in Ohio. If your kid calls in a threat to the school, you may be charged financially with costs for police and responses. And I do believe most of our threats are being called in to disrupt school, to maybe even get out of something because some kids aren't ready. Maybe it's even an AP test. And I think what we have to do is make a careful group decision about whether we evacuate or cancel school. But I think we also have to have a policy where if we cancel school, we make it up. You know, that 3-day weekend you thought you were having in February, well, you're not having it now because we're making up the day. Oh, your spring break is being shortened because of all the days of school we've lost because of these threats. And I think we could turn the climate around so that kids would think, this is not funny. This is not something that we want to happen because we're just going to have to make up the days. It's not like we're actually going to get out of school. And we could evacuate the school. We could go to another location, put everybody in a gym at another high school and say, okay, you're all writing an essay on today, you're turning it in, and you're getting a grade on it. So basically, what can we do to keep the education process going and to let everybody know this is, in fact, serious? Who conducts the threat assessment? I already stressed the multidisciplinary approach, but I think it's important that you see who is recommended to be on the team. Maybe your school has a police officer and SRO. maybe you don't, and the law enforcement representative has to come from the city or the county. Certainly, we've got to have a school administrator involved, and school mental health professionals, psychologists, social workers, and counselors do in fact need training on threat assessment. They need to know the best instruments. We'll talk about those in just a few moments. And obviously we need a teacher or teachers who know the kid in question well, because they can talk about what's actually happening in the classroom. Are we having any discipline problems? Maybe the student reportedly threatened is in the class. Have we noticed any kind of issues whatsoever? Earlier I made the statement, we need to interview the student who was reportedly threatened. How did you feel when he said that? Have you had a problem getting along before? Has he ever done anything to you? Were you worried at all? I mean, what if they say, he was just joking. We talk with each other all the time in that particular manner. And then often the threat of violence is witnessed by other students. How did they perceive that? Did they think it was serious? What was their concern, if any? So what's involved? Really pretty much a four-step process that we're going through today. Identification, evaluation, intervention, follow-up. You wouldn't have to look very far to find some issues like second grader expelled from school because he brought his Cub Scout camping eating utensil to school. It was in his backpack. He was on a Cub Scout outing last weekend, and that little utensil has a knife, a fork, and a spoon. So we need to basically, with this group process, be able to sort out and make some better decisions about what needs to happen. And obviously very important that we have follow-up. One of the cases, and it was years ago, but the student at Thurston High School in Springfield, Oregon, was actually caught with guns at school. He was arrested that day. He was taken to the police headquarters. Unfortunately, the police and Thurston High School were not in communication, because that young man was released from the police that afternoon, killed both his parents, came to Thurston High School the next day, shot over 20 people. Very important. We have follow-up and communication between police and school officials. The mental health professional, by the way, it's not unusual for a private psychologist to put in writing at the request of parents, this student is safe, they are not a threat to themselves or anyone else. Well, do they have a crystal ball that the rest of us don't have? Unfortunately, our threat assessment and our ability to predict who would actually carry out a threat of violence isn't exactly as good as we would like it to be. It has improved in recent years. So school personnel really should not put in writing this student is not a threat to others. What we should put in writing is these are all the things that need to be put in place to reduce stressors and reduce the likelihood of a threat of violence being carried out. By the way, the U.S. Department of Education says clearly, you got an emergency situation, you have a threat of violence, you don't need to follow the typical, we get written parental permission before we involve our psychologist in the process. And maybe there is a previous evaluation that would be helpful. But most previous evaluations addressed academics and intelligence. They didn't really look at stressors. They didn't really look at coping mechanisms. But we need to figure out ways to support the student. And as I said earlier, written report with recommendations about protective factors, enhancing those that are in place and adding others. So sometimes I'm asked, what is generally perceived as the best instrument out there in terms of assessing violence in young people? Structured assessment of violent risk use. the SAVRI, which is available from PAR, Psychological Assessment Resources. And I'll have their website up in just a moment. First of all, though, as we're looking at risk and as we're looking at potential for violence, we need to recognize that there's two basic factors. One is a static risk factor. This is something that's never going away. If you were abused as a small child, that is a static risk factor. It will always be a part of your history. But a dynamic risk factor is one that is changeable. For example, a number of individuals have substance abuse problems. That's something that might have just developed. Thankfully, that's something that is amenable to treatment. So it's dynamic. It is changing. So the SAVRI, what is it really? It's structured clinical judgment. So it isn't just me sitting here kind of pulling things out of the air, trying to figure out what I need to look at or ask about next. It breaks down into 4 clinical areas, and we're going to go over each one of those right now. By the way, it is used for 12 to 18-year-olds. Right? And this systematic process is better than an unstructured process. 4 domains, 30 items in each domain, and the young person gets rated as low, medium, or high risk in those 4 domains. Protective factors are one of the domains, and a protective factor would be pro-social involvement, strong social support, attachment to other people, positive attitudes. Those are extremely important. If you remember the first case that I went over earlier, the student that I referred to as S, who lived with her natural parents. Her dad is a local minister. She's taking good care of her younger siblings after school. She's involved in the church. She volunteers at a retirement center. So those are some very important protective factors, because the SAVRI also looks at risk factors that are historical in terms of where a person might live, their exposure to violence, for example. Have they had disruptions in, caretaking? It looks at some other factors in terms of modulating emotions and whether they might have attention deficit disorder, for example, whether they have anger issues, whether they have a history of depression, whether they've had a history of self-injury. It also looked at their relationships with not only family and caregivers, it looks at their relationship with peers. What peer group are they in? Are they currently in a gang, for example? Have they been arrested? Do they have a history of juvenile delinquency? And I'll just restate, basically saying this, in my opinion, is the best structured interview that we have to put in place. Now, the Secret Service gave us 11 key questions. And if you were to download those materials that I talked about earlier, well, you would find these key questions. What are the students' motives or goals if they were to carry out this threat of violence? How have they communicated it? Have they developed a hit list, for example? Have they shared this with other people? Have they shown an unusual interest in other mass violence in our country? I mean, I'm really sorry to tell you that a number of our students that are disturbed have been fascinated, not with just guns, weapons, violence, violent video games, and bombs. They have been fascinated with other school shooters. At the simplest level, I do believe the parents of adolescents need to pay a whole lot more attention. I actually believe when you have a disturbed child, you actually know it, but parents are really, really high on denial, and they need to be frequently and easily going in and out of their child's room. And if your kid's bulletin board is full of pictures and articles about school shooters, I think that's a pretty severe warning sign. You need mental health services. And if you don't know where to go, call up and talk to the school counselor, school psychologist, and get the referral for the needed services in your community. And as I said earlier, attack-related behaviors, plans, trying to get a hold of weapons. You know, in that Arapahoe High School report is going to say something like 10 students knew that the young man had not only threatened to kill the debate coach, but he was seeking and even had obtained a weapon. So how do we get them to come forward? And one of our challenges, and I like to ask students themselves, our search the literature, why don't they come forward and tell us if somebody makes a threat of violence? Here's what they say. I didn't want to get involved. I did not think it could happen. I feared retaliation. I have been conditioned not to tell. That word snitch, I wish we could take it out of our dictionaries. And by the way, as an adult watching today, if you were to get help for an elderly neighbor, is anybody going to call you a snitch? Are they going to call you a good, responsible person? I once had a student share with me, you know, when I was middle school, I did exactly what you're saying to do. I went in and I told the school counselor exactly why I was so concerned about my friend and their behavior and their threats. He made me feel like I was some kind of a snitch. That young person needed to have been rewarded, need to have been assured we're going to take steps immediately to make sure nothing happens. And your friend, if they do find out that you're the person that came to me, they may be angry at you for a while, but believe me, you have done the right thing, and ultimately, they may even thank you. This is what a good friend does. So back to these questions. Question number 5, does the student have the capacity to act? We go back to my student S. Did I give you any indication that anyone, the police or the school threat assessment team, ever determined that she had the capacity to carry out an attack against the school? The answer to that is no. This is a very important one about hopelessness and despair. We do know that about 2/3 of school shooters had a history of being suicidal. Any trusting relationship with an adult. Let me quote the shooter from Pearl, Mississippi on his Secret Service interview. If just one adult had cared about me, I probably wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have shot all those people at school. Secret Service agent says, what about your mom? She cared. No, she didn't. What about your teacher? What about your principal? No, nobody cared. And what I think is so important, every kid in America needs to know that adults at school care whether or not you show up tomorrow or not. We've got to have them feeling connected to our school. And unfortunately, in some of the aspects of our society, violence can be seen as a way to solve problems. And a student could, in fact, be involved with other students that are known to be violent. And then we always have to look at, are their words, are they really consistent with actions and plans, or is this just something they've said because they were extremely angry? And then when I've been a part of a threat assessment team, literally we're trying to find out everything we possibly can about the student's history. Have we ever evaluated them? Okay, he's new to our school. What can we find out? He was in our elementary school last year before he came to middle school. Call him. What happened? What did we find out? What do we know about his family? Have we ever done an evaluation? What did that evaluation tell us? What is currently happening in the family? What's currently happening in the classroom? And hopefully, if we approach the student in the right way, they will share with us how things are actually going in their lives. So FERPA, I talked about it earlier. And I cannot overemphasize this. In fact, I find schools often have FERPAphobia. To my knowledge, no school in this entire country has ever lost federal funds for violating FERPA. And by the way, if I ever do get sued, sue me for something you think I shouldn't have done. Sue me for sharing information from somebody you wished I hadn't shared that information with. In our schools, and I'll quote the Arapahoe superintendent for the Littleton schools in Littleton, Colorado, he said, our staff knew a lot. Unfortunately, they didn't share it with each other. So it's important that we do that and that we learn lessons from tragedies like that. And I've mentioned that this whole threat assessment has to be in the context of a caring school environment where kids feel connected. I also talked about ways that we need to end the code or the conspiracy of silence, and how can we address issues and concerns before it becomes something that's extreme. And one of the things I really like, and I helped develop in my old district, basically the safety pledge, where the student is saying and signing, I will let an adult determine the seriousness of a violent threat. I'll report the presence of a weapon to the nearest adult at school immediately. Kids sign it, parents sign it. And where I think that we have dropped the ball is not getting students themselves more involved in school safety. We need to have forums. We need to discuss it in classrooms. We need to welcome their input. We need to have surveys of students to find out how they perceive their school and safety issues. We can have them shade the areas of the floor plan of the school where they don't feel safe. We can have them do it at various times of the day. I wish I could tell you there's a magic formula. There's a perfect checklist. I do know the state of Colorado is pursuing finding evidence-based threat assessment procedures and protocols. I'm not sure such a protocol or assessment actually exists. And I'm going to go back to a team of people carefully gathering information and using things like the SOVRI, which is a structured risk assessment. And all schools must have a threat assessment team. That's the only way we're going to meet the expected standard of care right now. And we need to be looking at reducing stressors, putting our recommendations in writing, and following the best practices from the U.S. Department of Education and the Secret Service. And I'm going to turn it back to Karen for questions.
Thank you so much, Scott. Before we get into some particular content questions, I do want to say several of you asked about being able to have access to the slides afterward. I do want to reiterate that this has been recorded, and within a week, the recording will be on the PSI website, which you can see there in that first bullet as you're looking at that slide. So you can pull it up after the recording is there. There's also Dr. Poland's email address there at the bottom if you want to pursue this in another fashion. Scott, we did have a couple of intriguing questions. One of them I think you answered. What do you think is the best instrument to evaluate threats of violence? So unless you have any other thoughts on that, I think you covered that one. Am I correct?
Well, I would only add that PAR also has an instrument called the PETRA, P-E-T-R-A, which is standardized and was actually developed by a school psychologist. So I would direct them to 4PAR Incorporated.
Okay. Here's one. What do you think about realistic crisis drills that involve the sounds of gunfire and simulated injury or deaths?
I am totally opposed. I believe that a number of school administrators and police have really gone over the top. As a psychologist, I'm immediately going to say, First of all, you have no idea of the trauma history of your students and your faculty. And at the very least, if you insist on a realistic crisis drill, you should survey your staff and students beforehand, do a pre and a post test, and if they don't feel any safer, why are you conducting these drills? I also believe it gives everybody the wrong impression. It gives them the idea that schools are unsafe when they're very unsafe places. And all we really need to do is practice moving staff and students to protected places, making sure kids listen to the nearest adult, and we don't need sounds of gunfire, SWAT teams, and simulated blood to practice moving staff and students to safe places.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Here's one. Where do you consider the family history of mental illness, such as bipolar, etc.?
Well, we do know that there are a number of mental health issues that can be genetic, but I think it's really important that we not automatically conclude that a student has a serious mental illness just because their parents do. And in your example, I would suggest that part of our challenge is going to be interacting appropriately with the parent when they have severe mental health issues. But let's be careful not to overreact. Maybe we need to gather our own special education evaluations and figure out whether the student in question has a particular mental health diagnosis or disability, but don't automatically conclude their problem because of issues with their parents.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is there variability in the school system of what risk assessment must be done? It seems like many schools just ignore this problem.
There's tremendous variability. And actually, I've been really frustrated that, we've had these national recommendations really for 16 years. If you are a school principal or a superintendent, how have you ignored this national recommendation to have threat assessment teams, protocols, and procedures? In fact, doesn't that make a lot more sense than bringing in and having the police do an active shooter drill? Because very important that we try to get out in front of this with regards to having good procedures in place. I've also been frustrated to read that a kid is expelled for something they said. Okay. To me, it's like, yes, they do need a consequence, but expulsion for a year is a bit over the top. If they don't have a plan, they don't have a weapon, they aren't researching how to do it, they don't have a hit list, I don't think this warrants an expulsion from school.
Okay, kind of a follow-up question from somebody else. They asked, how would I go about finding out if my school has a plan, a written plan?
Well, first of all, it'd be really interesting to go to the school district website and do a little search about threat assessment or threats, protocols, and procedures. Probably you're not going to find anything, but it really should be there. The plan for the district, but maybe even most importantly, how could a parent or a student call a behavior of concern to the attention of the administration? So let's say they find nothing on the website. Then I would talk with my building principal. I would, if you don't get anywhere, I would download the recommendations from the Secret Service, the FBI. I look at information from school safety centers like they have in Texas or Colorado. I try to get their attention. But, I think one thing that would really be important, I know that PSI archives these webinars. Right now, a lot of school principals are incredibly busy. I get that. But once those students go home, they're going to have a lot more time. And wouldn't it be great to view this webinar with your counselors, your assistant principal, pull in your nurse, your school psychologist? Wouldn't this be a good launching point to get information and then put something in place in our school?
That's a great tip, Scott. And sadly, we've run out of time. For those of you who we haven't been able to answer your question, As I said, both of our email addresses are there. As soon as the recording goes off, of this webinar goes off, you will be instantly given a survey, which you must complete and submit. And after that, within the next week, you will be receiving via your email address a certificate that will give you the contact hour for completing this webinar. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to ask any of us. And again, thank you on behalf of everybody at PSI for attending this webinar. And thank you, Dr. Poland.
You're welcome.